The silence came first. That was the thing nobody ever talked about afterward. The survivors, the diplomats, the military analysts who spent years picking apart every second of what happened, they talked about the weapons and the tactics and the impossible odds. But the ones who were actually there, the ones who lived through it, they always started with the silence. Space was already silent. Everyone knew that. But this was different. This was the silence of 43 warships cutting their engines simultaneously, drifting in perfect formation, waiting. The silence of a crew of 312 human beings holding their breath at the edge of the Carveth Nebula while something ancient and enormous, and utterly without mercy, moved through the dark toward them. Captain Alara Voss had been awake for 31 hours. She stood at the forward observation window of the UNSC Iron Meridian and looked at the stars and did not blink. She was 51 years old. She had gray at her temples and a scar along her right collarbone from an accident during a training exercise 20 years ago, and eyes that her crew described, when they thought she could not hear them, as the kind of eyes that had already seen the worst thing and were no longer afraid of anything else. She was afraid right now. She was just very good at not showing it. The Kethara had been moving through the galaxy for 60 years. That was the number the historians used, 60 years. But it was misleading because it implied a beginning, a specific moment when they had arrived and started, and the truth was nobody knew when the Kethara had started. The first confirmed contact was 60 years ago when a Galenthi exploration vessel near the outer rim detected an anomalous energy signature and sent a probe, and the probe sent back 11 seconds of footage before it went dark. 11 seconds of something vast and black and structured in ways that made human eyes hurt to look at directly. After that, the Galenthi sent a patrol fleet. The patrol fleet did not come back. The Galenthi were a civilization 4,000 years older than humanity. They had standing armies of 10,000 warships. They had weapons that could crack the crust of a planet. They had fought and won wars against 3 other major civilizations in their long history, and they had never lost a sustained military engagement. They lasted 9 years against the Kethara, before the last Galenthi world went silent. 9 years, 4,000 years of civilization, gone. The Mervaki fell in 6 years, the Thessari Collective in 4. The Ondeth Empire, which had at its peak controlled over 300 star systems and was considered by galactic historians to be the most militarily advanced civilization of the current era, lasted 11 years before its capital world stopped broadcasting. The Kethara did not destroy planets. That was the thing that kept analysts up at night, the detail that sat wrong in every report and every briefing and every desperate late-night conversation between commanders who were trying to understand what they were fighting. They did not leave rubble. They did not leave craters or radiation signatures or any of the conventional evidence of conquest. They left quiet. They moved through a system, and when they left, everything was still standing. The cities, the infrastructure, the ships in orbit, the stations, all of it still there, still intact, still running in some cases. Just empty. Whatever the Kethara took, they took only the living things. Nobody knew why. The xenobiologists had 17 theories. The intelligence analysts had 30. None of them agreed. None of them mattered, because understanding why the Kethara did what they did had not stopped them from doing it, and 43 years of trying to stop them through conventional military force had produced nothing except a longer list of civilizations that no longer existed. Humanity had been watching for 50 years. They had watched the Galenthi fall. They had watched the Mervaki and the Thessari and the Ondeth. They had sent observers and analysts and intelligence gatherers, and they had collected data with the quiet, desperate intensity of people who know they are next and are trying to find the one thing that might change the outcome. The Galactic Remnant Council, what was left of the governing bodies of 6 fallen civilizations, operating out of a station near human space because they had nowhere else to go, had come to Earth 3 years ago with the data, and with a request, and with the specific exhausted grief of people who had already lost everything, and were asking someone else to try because they had run out of someone's. Earth had said yes. Not immediately, not without argument. The debates in the UN Security Council had lasted 8 months, and the debates in every national government had lasted longer, and the debates among the general population were still ongoing in some form, because humanity was not a species that reached consensus quickly or quietly. But in the end, the answer was yes, because the alternative was waiting for the Kethara to arrive on their own timeline, and that was not something any serious person was willing to accept. Admiral Chen Baolin, who commanded the combined human military response, and who had spent the 3 years since the Council's visit sleeping approximately 5 hours a night and working every other hour, had said in his final briefing before the Karvath deployment, "We are not going to outweapon them. We are not going to outarmor them. We are not going to win by being bigger or stronger or faster, because every civilization that tried that is gone. We are going to win by being something they have never encountered before. We are going to win by being us." Nobody in the briefing room had been entirely sure what that meant. Captain Alara Voss had thought about it for 3 years, and she still was not entirely sure. But she had her orders, and she had her crew, and she had the Iron Meridian, which was the most extensively modified warship in human history, and she had 31 hours of data gathered from the passive sensor arrays she had seeded throughout the Karvath Nebula in the 6 weeks before this moment. She had a plan. It was not a good plan in any conventional sense. It was the kind of plan that a military academy instructor would have returned with extensive red marks and a note suggesting the student reconsider their approach. It had 17 distinct phases, each of which depended on the previous one succeeding, and the margin for error in several of them was small enough to make her chief tactical officer lose sleep on nights when he was not already losing sleep for other reasons. But it was a plan built entirely from things the Kethara had never seen. That was the one principle Admiral Baolin had given her. Whatever you do, do not do anything they have seen before. Because everything they have seen before they have already learned to counter. The only weapon we have is novelty. Novelty, Voss had said in the briefing, against a civilization that has destroyed 6 others. Baolin had looked at her with the eyes of someone carrying 60 years of losses and said, "Yes." The Kethara fleet appeared on sensors at 3:47 hours ship time. It was large. She had known it would be large. The intelligence data had given her estimates, but the sensors resolving the contacts into specific signatures still produced a number that her tactical officer, Commander James Ockafer, read aloud in a voice that was impressively steady given the circumstances. 207 vessels, he said, ranging in mass from roughly equivalent to our destroyer class up to something approximately 40 times the mass of the Iron Meridian. Voss looked at the tactical display. 207 contacts arranged in a formation that the intelligence analysts had catalogued as Kethara Standard Advanced Configuration, a precise geometric pattern that maximized their collective sensor coverage and weapons overlap, and had never, in 60 years of recorded engagements, been successfully disrupted by any opposing force. She said, "Initiate Phase 1. Phase 1 was silence. The Iron Meridian powered down everything that was not essential for crew survival. Weapons offline, shields offline, active sensors offline, drives at 0. The ship drifted, dark and quiet, in the shadow of a dense gas cloud at the edge of the nebula. The Kethara formation moved through the system at their standard pace, methodical, unhurried. The sensors the Voss had seeded through the nebula fed her data on their movements, passive sensors only, no active emissions, nothing for the Kethara to detect. She watched them move and read their patterns and timed their cycles. The Kethara were consistent. That was one of the things the intelligence data had established clearly. Their formation discipline was extraordinary. Their response times were extraordinary. Their adaptation to new weapons and tactics had been extraordinary in every engagement ever recorded. But they were consistent. They operated within a framework of behavior that was logical and efficient and had worked perfectly for 60 years and therefore had never needed to be questioned. That consistency was the only crack Voss had found in 60 years of data. The first phase lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of silence and patience and watching and waiting while 207 Kethara vessels moved through the Karvath system on their standard survey pattern. Her crew did not speak above a murmur. They did not move unnecessarily. 312 human beings sitting in the dark and breathing slowly and trusting their captain. At hour 4, the Kethara formation reached its predictable pause point, the moment in their survey pattern when the lead element stopped to consolidate sensor data before the fleet adjusted its formation for the next phase of approach. Voss had timed it from the seeded sensor data. She had a 30-second window. She used 3 seconds of it. Phase 2 was a single transmission, not a weapon, not a tactical signal, a transmission on a frequency that the Kethara had never used and that no other civilization had ever transmitted on, a frequency that the human analysts had identified in the raw sensor data from 60 years of observations as present in the Kethara's internal communications, but never in any external broadcast. The transmission was 7 seconds long. It was a mathematical structure built from patterns extracted from the Kethara's own communications, not a message in any linguistic sense, not a greeting, not a challenge. Something stranger, something that used their own internal language's structural logic to construct a sequence that should have been impossible to produce from outside their civilization. It was, in the framework of their communication system, approximately equivalent to hearing your own heartbeat coming from outside your body. The Kethara formation stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Complete cessation of movement across all 207 vessels simultaneously. Akafar reported it in a voice that, for the first time in 4 hours, broke slightly at the edges. Voss said nothing. She watched the tactical display and counted. 8 seconds of complete stillness from 207 vessels that had never in 60 years of recorded behavior stopped moving during an approach. Then the formation began to change, not to disperse or retreat, to reconfigure. The precise geometric pattern of their standard advance broke apart and reformed into something different, something the analysts watching the sensor feed from the seeded arrays had never seen in any recorded engagement. The Kethara were not preparing to attack. They were not preparing to absorb. They were arranging themselves into a configuration that had no tactical purpose. They were listening. Voss exhaled slowly. Phase 2 had worked. She had exactly what the plan required: Kethara attention, focused and anomalous, directed towards something they could not categorize. She said Phase 3. Phase 3 was the Iron Meridian moving. Not fast, not aggressively, not toward the Kethara fleet. Laterally, at a speed that was well within the Iron Meridian's capabilities, but that was calibrated precisely to a specific parameter, the movement speed of the largest class of Kethara vessel according to the intelligence data. She was matching their own mobility profile, moving at a pace and in a pattern that their sensors would read as within their own operational parameters. It was an illusion, a thin one, but it bought time. The Kethara formation shifted again. 3 of the largest vessels, the 40 times mass behemoths that Akafar had identified as probable command ships, moved to the outer edge of the formation and oriented toward the Iron Meridian. The remaining vessels held their listening configuration. 3 command ships breaking formation to investigate a contact, while the main fleet maintained an anomalous non-tactical configuration. It was the most un-Kethara behavior in 60 years of recorded data. Voss had planned for exactly this. Phase 4 through Phase 9 happened in the next 11 minutes, and they happened fast. Phase 4 was the Iron Meridian going fully active. Every system online simultaneously, shields up, weapons hot, drives at full power. The transition from apparent debris to fully combat-capable warship in under 4 seconds, a drill her crew had practiced 800 times in the 6 months before deployment. Phase 5 was movement, not toward the 3 approaching command ships. Through the gap in the main formation that their movement had created, a corridor barely wide enough for the Iron Meridian to pass through without coming within effective weapons range of the flanking vessels. Akafar had calculated the corridor dimensions from the seated sensor data, and her helmsman, Lieutenant Commander Solis, had trained on a simulated version of it for 4 months. Solis took the Iron Meridian through the corridor at maximum safe speed, and the gap was 400 meters wider than it needed to be, and Voss allowed herself half a second of pure relief before Phase 6. Phase 6 was the dispersal charges. 16 of them, fired from the Iron Meridian's secondary launch bays as she moved through the corridor, each one drifting to a calculated position before activating. Not weapons in any conventional sense. Electromagnetic pulse generators of a specific frequency. A frequency selected from the intelligence data as one that should theoretically interfere with the crystalline sensor architecture that the analysts believed the Kethara used for formation coordination. Should theoretically, the analysts had been careful about that language. They did not know for certain. Nobody had ever been close enough to the Kethara in operational conditions to test the theory. Voss had decided to test it now. All 16 charges fired simultaneously. The Kethara formation did not collapse. It did not disintegrate. What it did was hesitate, a measurable, instruments-confirmed hesitation of approximately 12 seconds across the majority of the formation, during which the precise coordination of 204 vessels became slightly less precise. Slightly. The analysts watching from the seated arrays would later measure the deviation from their standard formation parameters at an average of 2.3%. 2.3% deviation in a formation of 204 warships was, in absolute terms, a very small number. In the context of what Voss needed to do next, it was everything. Phases 7 through 9 were simultaneous, and they depended on that 2.3% deviation creating specific gaps in the Kethara's collective sensor coverage that her analysts had modeled and her crew had rehearsed. 3 separate strike packages launched from the Iron Meridian during the 12-second hesitation window. Not the conventional human weapons that the Kethara had encountered in limited previous engagements with human military vessels and had adapted to counter within hours. Something older. Something that no spacefaring civilization in the current galactic era had used in combat in over 1,000 years. Kinetic impactors. Simple dense metal rods accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light. No explosive payload. No electromagnetic signature. No energy emissions of any kind until the moment of impact. Just mass and velocity, the oldest physics in the universe, fired through the gaps that the 2.3% deviation had opened in the Kethara's sensor coverage, and aimed at 3 specific targets that the intelligence data suggested were coordination nexus points within the formation. The Kethara had no record of kinetic impactors in 60 years of engagement data. Every civilization they had encountered had moved past kinetic weapons generations before first contact. The concept of accelerating a metal rod and simply throwing it at something was so primitive by galactic standards that it had not appeared in any weapons analysis the Kethara had ever needed to conduct. Their point defense systems were not configured for it. Their formation geometry did not account for it. Their adaptation protocols had no template for it. All 3 impactors hit. The effect on the Kethara formation was visible on sensors within seconds, and it was not small. The 3 coordination nexus vessels, if the intelligence analysis was correct about their function, took structural damage that was severe enough to change their energy signatures fundamentally. The formation coordination that had been 2.3% degraded during the hesitation window dropped to something the analysts watching would later estimate at 30 to 40% degraded, as the damaged Nexus vessels struggled to maintain their function. In a fleet of 207 ships, 30 to 40% degradation in coordination was catastrophic. Not fatal, not immediately. The Kethara were not finished and Voss knew it, and the next 8 minutes were the most dangerous of the entire engagement, because a partially degraded Kethara fleet was still enormously more powerful than one human warship, and the degradation would not last indefinitely. Their systems would adapt and compensate and restore coordination, and when that happened, the iron meridian needed to be somewhere specific. Phases 10 through 17 were the hardest. They were hard because they required the iron meridian to stay inside the Kethara formation, inside it, surrounded by it, threading through the gaps in their degraded coordination. While Akafar and her weapons crews fired and reloaded and fired again at specific targets identified in real time from the seeded sensor data. And while Solis flew the ship through maneuvers that she was constructing on the spot, because no simulation could have prepared for the exact configuration of 207 partially disoriented alien warships in real time. The Iron Meridian was hit 7 times in those 8 minutes. The first hit took out the port shield array. The second hit destroyed 2 of the secondary weapons bays. The third hit, the worst, penetrated to Deck 4 and killed 11 crew members instantly, and wounded 23 more, and started a fire that the damage control teams fought for the rest of the engagement. Voss heard the casualty reports in her earpiece, and noted them and kept giving orders. This was the thing the military academy instructors could not teach, and the simulation programs could not replicate. The thing that 60 years of Kethara data showed no other commanding officer of any species had managed to maintain under these conditions. She did not stop. She did not freeze. She did not hesitate. She did not pause to process the losses or recalculate the odds or consider the option of retreat. She kept moving forward through the plan with the specific human stubbornness that had no galactic equivalent, the refusal to accept that a situation was finished until it was actually finished, the bone-deep inability to quit that had driven her species out of caves and across oceans and into space. And that was, in this moment, the only thing standing between 207 Kethara warships and everything that existed behind them. Akafar fired. Solis flew. The crew fought their fires and sealed their breaches and carried their wounded and kept every system that still functioned running at its maximum capacity. In the 44th minute of the engagement, the Kethara formation coordination restored. Voss had known this moment would come. She had planned for it. It was the hinge point of everything, the moment when the window closed and whatever had been accomplished in 44 minutes was all there was going to be. She said Phase 17. Phase 17 was the transmission. Not a weapon, not a tactic, a message, broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, in every language in the intelligence database, in the mathematical structure that had opened this engagement, in the Kethara's own internal communication patterns, in raw audio and visual and electromagnetic spectrum. The message was not a surrender, it was not a threat, it was not a plea. It was data. 60 years of data, every engagement, every fallen civilization, every analysis and observation and theory that humanity had assembled in 50 years of watching and studying and preparing, sent in a compressed burst transmission directly into the Kethara fleet's communication architecture, using the access pathway that the 7-second Phase 2 transmission had opened, and that the analysts had identified as still active through the sensor data. The message said, in every language that might mean anything to something ancient and vast and utterly alien, "We know what you have done. We have watched. We have learned, and we are not finished. The Kethara formation held at restored coordination for 90 seconds. Then something happened that the analysts watching from the seated sensor arrays would spend the next decade verifying and arguing about, and eventually accepting as real. The formation changed again. For the third time in this engagement, it shifted into a configuration that had no tactical purpose, different from the listening configuration, different from anything in 60 years of recorded data, a configuration that the xenolinguistics team brought in to analyze the sensor records afterward would eventually suggest was the Kethara equivalent of stillness, of consideration, of thought. For 11 minutes, the Kethara fleet of 207 vessels sat motionless at restored coordination, in a configuration that meant nothing militarily and everything else, while the damaged Iron Meridian drifted at the edge of the formation with her surviving crew working in silence, and Alara Voss stood at her command station and waited. Then the Kethara fleet moved. Outward, away from the Karvath system, away from human space, all 207 vessels together, accelerating steadily on a vector that took them back the way they had come, back toward the deep dark where they had originated, moving with the same methodical precision that had carried them through 60 years of conquest. Akefer watched the sensor readings and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "They're leaving." Voss said, "Yes." He said, "All of them." She said, "All of them." The silence that followed was different from the silence at the beginning. That silence had been held breath and fear. This one was something that did not have a name yet, something that would need a new word, and humanity would spend years trying to find it. Solis from the helm said very quietly, "Did we just win?" Voss looked at the tactical display, at 207 Kethara vessels moving away from human space, at the stars beyond them that were still there, still burning, still full of the systems that still existed because of what had happened in the last 44 minutes. She thought about 11 crew members on Deck 4. She thought about 6 fallen civilizations and 60 years of silence. She thought about Admiral Bowlin saying we are going to win by being us, and not being entirely sure what that meant. She thought she understood it now. She said, "I think we made them think. That's enough for today." The debrief lasted months. The implications lasted years. The Kethara did not return, not in the months after Karvath, not in the years that followed, not in the decade of cautious watching that the combined human and remnant council intelligence apparatus maintained with every sensor they had. What they did instead, 14 months after Karvath, was something that produced a moment of pure stunned silence in the monitoring station that first detected it. They transmitted a signal directed at human space on the same frequency that had opened the engagement, using the same mathematical structure, something that took 8 months to decode, and that, when it was decoded, produced in the xenolinguistics team a reaction that ranged from disbelief to tears depending on the individual. It was not a surrender. It was not a threat. It was not an explanation of 60 years of conquest or any acknowledgement of the civilizations that were gone. It was a question. In the mathematical language that human analysts had spent 50 years extracting from 60 years of Kethara communications, shaped into the structural patterns that their own internal transmissions used, the message asked something that had no precise translation, but that the team rendered after 8 months of work, as approximately this: "What are you that you do not stop?" Alara Voss, retired from active command and working as a senior advisor to the Remnant Council restoration effort, read the translated message in her office on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee that went cold while she sat with it. She thought about her crew, about Deck 4, about 301 people who had flown into the center of 207 alien warships and kept going. She thought about humanity, about everything the message contained. 60 years of watching, 50 years of preparation, the specific terrible patient stubbornness of a species that had learned long ago that the universe did not care whether you survived and had decided to survive anyway. She began writing a response. It took her 6 months. She did not write it alone. She brought in everyone she could find who had something true to say about what humans were and why they did not stop, and she listened to all of them, and she wrote and rewrote until what remained was honest. The response was long. It contained history and failure and loss, and the specific human knowledge of what it felt like to be on the edge of extinction and to keep moving anyway. It contained Carveth, described from the inside. It contained 11 names from Deck 4. It contained, near the end, something that Voss wrote herself and that she believed was true. She wrote, "We do not stop because stopping was never an option we accepted. Not when the cave was cold, not when the ocean was wide, not when the stars were far, not when you came. We are the species that looks at the end of everything and says, not yet. We have always been this, we will always be this. You asked what we are. This is what we are." The Kethara received the response. The monitoring stations recorded the transmission's arrival and watched for 60 days, and detected no reply and no movement, and nothing that could be interpreted as a response of any kind. Then on the 61st day, something changed in the data from the deep space. Arrays watching the vector the Kethara fleet had taken from Carveth. Signals complex, dense, the same internal communication frequency, the same mathematical structure, but at a volume and intensity that the analysts had never recorded before. Not directed at human space. Internal. The Kethara fleet, somewhere in the dark between stars, talking to itself with an urgency that had no precedent in 60 years of recorded data. What they were saying, nobody could decode. The mathematical structures were too dense, too layered, too far beyond anything the existing analysis framework could parse. But they were talking. For the first time in 60 years of observation, the Kethara were not moving. They were stopped somewhere in the dark between stars. And they were thinking. Voss read the analyst report in her office and sat with it for a long time. Outside, the window Earth moved through its ordinary day, loud and complicated and full of people living their lives in the specific stubborn human way, not because the universe had promised them anything, but because they had decided to. She thought, good. Let them think. We will be here when they are done. The end.